For the United States, World War II did not begin on the shores of France or with the roar of artillery in Normandy. It developed gradually, in the offices of politicians, in Atlantic ports, in Detroit factories, in diplomatic negotiations with allies, and in alarming intelligence reports. The opening of the Second Front in Western Europe was not an impulsive decision, but the culmination of a long chain of events, fears, calculations, and responsibilities that the U.S. could no longer ignore. After World War I, American society was deeply traumatized. More than 116,000 dead, millions wounded in Europe, and the feeling that the sacrifices had not brought lasting peace. Therefore, in the 1920s and 1930s, isolationism prevailed in the United States, the belief that the country should stay out of European conflicts. Congress passed neutrality laws that prohibited the supply of weapons to warring states. A significant part of the population believed that the oceans were sufficient protection and that the wars of the Old World should not become American wars. However, reality began to shatter this illusion. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933 initially seemed to be an internal European problem. But by the end of the 1930s, it had become clear that Nazism was not just an ideology, but an aggressive project of global domination. Anschluss of Austria. Dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Invasion of Poland in September 1939. The start of World War II meant that the balance of power in the world was rapidly collapsing. If Germany conquered Europe, the U.S. would find itself alone against a hostile continent that controlled the industry, resources, and ports of the Atlantic. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood the danger much earlier than most of his fellow citizens. While formally maintaining neutrality, he gradually drew the U.S. into the war economically and strategically. In 1941, the Lend-Lease program was adopted, an unprecedented system of aid to the Allies. The U.S. supplied Britain, and later the USSR, with tanks, aircraft, trucks, fuel, food. In fact, America became the arsenal of democracy, even though it was not officially at war with Germany. After France's defeat in 1940, Great Britain remained the only Western power openly at war with Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain showed that even the most powerful navy and air force cannot guarantee victory without allies. Prime Minister Winston Churchill repeatedly appealed to the U.S. with the following demand. Europe is suffocating. Without American participation, Germany cannot be stopped. For the U.S., the fall of Britain would mean disaster. The loss of an ally. Control of the Atlantic by the enemy. A threat to maritime trade. The danger of a direct attack in the future. After Germany's attack on the USSR in 1941, the war became total. Millions of soldiers died on the Eastern Front. The battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk exhausted the Red Army, despite its heroic resistance. The Soviet leadership constantly demanded that the Allies open a second front in Western Europe in order to force Germany to fight on two fronts. Reduce pressure on the USSR. Accelerate the defeat of the Wehrmacht. The procrastination of the US and Britain bred mistrust, but at the same time, the realization that without a large-scale amphibious operation, the war could not be won. On December 7, 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor finally destroyed American isolationism. The U.S. entered the war, first against Japan, and soon after against Germany. From then on, the question was no longer whether to fight, but how and where to deliver the decisive blow. The American command understood that the war in Europe was key. Germany was the main enemy. Victory was only possible through a direct invasion of the continent. By 1943, it had become clear that aerial bombardment and naval blockade alone would not break Germany. A ground operation was needed that would open the way to the heart of Europe. Liberate the occupied countries. Force the Wehrmacht to disperse its forces. A landing in France was becoming inevitable. It was a risky, expensive, and extremely bloody plan, but there was no other way to victory. Thus, the U.S. decision to support the opening of the Second Front was dictated by The threat to its own security. Its responsibility to its allies. The need to end the war. The desire to shape the post-war world. Normandy had not yet been named. The date had not yet been set. But the path to June 6, 1944, had already been laid, by the logic of war, the fear of defeat, and the hope of victory. By 1942, the United States was already a full-fledged participant in World War II, but the question of opening a second front in Western Europe remained unresolved. The Allies were waiting for decisive action, the enemy was strengthening its defenses, and America itself was faced with a difficult choice between caution and the need to take risks. Pressure on the U.S. was mounting from several directions at once: political, military, diplomatic, and moral. The American leadership understood that delaying could be too costly. External political pressure from the Allies. The strongest external pressure on the U.S. came from its main allies, Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Each of these countries had its own reasons for demanding the immediate opening of a second front, but they all agreed on one thing: without active U.S. involvement, the war could drag on for years. For Great Britain, the war had become a struggle for survival. Although the country had survived 1940, its resources were depleted. Churchill was well aware that without the American army, Britain would not be able to return to the continent on its own. He persistently convinced Washington that a landing in France was the only way to liberate Western Europe. The Soviet Union, in turn, bore the brunt of the land war. Millions of soldiers died in battle, and entire cities were destroyed. The Soviet leadership increasingly demanded action from its allies, viewing any delay as political calculation and even betrayal. For the USSR, the Second Front was not just a military necessity, it was a chance for survival. Internal disputes in the U.S. Within the United States itself, the question of the Second Front sparked heated debate. Military, political, and public figures did not agree on when and where America should strike its main blow. Some generals insisted that the U.S. Army was not yet ready for a large-scale amphibious operation. It lacked combat experience, modern technology, and coordination between the branches of the military. Landing in France without sufficient preparation could end in disaster, similar to the defeats of World War I. Others believed that delay would only play into Germany's hands. Each month gave the Wehrmacht the opportunity to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, build up reserves, and prepare for defense. Time was working against the Allies. Military pressure and the realities of the front lines. By 1942 to 1943, the war had engulfed almost the entire world. American troops were already fighting in North Africa and Sicily, gradually gaining combat experience. These campaigns became a kind of testing ground before the main operation in Europe. However, they also showed the limitations of indirect strikes. Victories in Africa and Italy did not lead to the collapse of Germany. The main forces of the Wehrmacht remained on the Eastern Front and in Western Europe. Without a direct invasion of France, the war risked turning into endless attrition. The American command was becoming increasingly aware that a decisive battle was inevitable, and that it would take place where the enemy feared it most, on the coast of occupied France. Diplomatic conferences and decision-making. Allied conferences played an important role in shaping the final decision. At meetings of the leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition, the need for a joint large-scale operation became increasingly clear. During the Tehran Conference in 1943, the decision to open a second front was effectively finalized. The United States took on a key role in preparing and conducting the future landing. It was a political compromise, but at the same time a strategic commitment from which there was no turning back. The moral factor and responsibility. In addition to strategic calculations, there was also moral pressure. American society was becoming increasingly aware of the crimes of the Nazi regime, the mass repression, and the destruction of the civilian population. The war was no longer an abstract conflict somewhere far across the ocean. For the U.S., opening a second front was a matter of honor and leadership. The country with the greatest economic and military potential could not afford to remain in the shadows while others paid for victory with millions of lives. A path of no return. As a result of political pressure from the Allies, military realities, and internal debates, the U.S. gradually came to the inevitable conclusion: the second front must be opened, regardless of the risks. This decision meant taking on a colossal responsibility for the fate of Europe, the Allies, and the post-war world order. From then on, there was only one question left: how exactly to carry out this operation. The decision to open a second front did not in itself guarantee victory. A much more difficult task lay ahead: preparing the largest amphibious operation in human history. It required not only enormous resources, but also unprecedented coordination between countries, armies, navies, and air forces. It was at this stage that the war turned into a gigantic mechanism, where any mistake could ruin the entire plan. The operation was codenamed Operation Overlord, and from that moment on, preparations for it became the top priority for the United States and its allies. First of all, the question of command arose. American General Dwight David Eisenhower was chosen to lead the operation. His candidacy symbolized not only military professionalism but also political trust between the Allies. Eisenhower was to coordinate the actions of American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces, maintaining a balance between national interests and common goals. Preparations began with large-scale planning. Military analysts studied every kilometer of the coastline of Western Europe. Various landing options were considered, from Pas-de-Calais to Brittany. In the end, Normandy was chosen. It seemed a less obvious target for the Germans, had relatively convenient beaches, and allowed for a subsequent advance into the interior of France. Parallel to the planning, an unprecedented concentration of troops continued in Great Britain. The island was transformed into a huge military camp. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers arrived by sea, occupying barracks, temporary camps, even schools and farms. For many of them, Europe was unfamiliar, and the upcoming mission was the first real war in their lives. Training was conducted non-stop. Soldiers practiced disembarking from landing craft, storming fortifications, and coordinating with tanks and aircraft. The training was often brutal and dangerous: realistic conditions, live ammunition, night marches. The command understood that it was better to lose people in training than during a real invasion. Special attention was paid to technology. Thousands of landing ships, special amphibious tanks, and engineering vehicles for clearing minefields and obstacles were created for Overlord. American industry worked at full capacity, producing equipment on an unprecedented scale. In fact, the war in Europe was won before the first shot was fired, in factories and shipyards. The role of aviation was no less important. The Allies planned to achieve complete air superiority. Bombers systematically destroyed railway junctions, bridges, and fuel depots in France to isolate the future battlefield. It was quiet, methodical work that did not attract public attention but was of decisive importance. Preparations for Overlord also required incredible secrecy. Even among the soldiers, only a few knew the true purpose of the exercises. Rumors and misinformation were spread, and chaos was deliberately created in minor details to conceal the main objective. The entire success of the operation depended on the element of surprise. As 1944 approached, the tension grew. Everyone understood that there would be no second chance. If the landing failed, the Allies would lose hundreds of thousands of people, and the war could drag on indefinitely. Eisenhower later admitted that the burden of responsibility was so great that he had prepared a speech in case of defeat even before the operation began. This marked the end of the preparation phase. The troops were assembled, the plans were drawn up, and the equipment was ready. Europe held its breath, unaware that the fate of the continent was already being decided in cramped headquarters rooms and on the foggy shores of Britain. One more crucial element remained: deceiving the enemy. Preparations for the Normandy landings were not limited to gathering troops and equipment. The Allies understood perfectly well that even the best prepared army could be destroyed if the enemy knew where and when it would strike. Therefore, alongside military planning, another, no less important war unfolded: a war of wits, illusions, and disinformation. For the landing to succeed, it was necessary not only to conceal the true direction of the attack, but also to convince the German command of a false version of events. This is how one of the most ambitious deception plans in military history was born. The German leadership expected an Allied invasion. There was no doubt about that. The only question was where exactly. The most logical place seemed to be the Pas-de-Calais region, the narrowest part of the English Channel. It was there that the distance between Britain and France was minimal and logistics were simplest. The Allies decided to play on this logic. In Britain, they began to create the appearance of preparations for a massive invasion in Pas-de-Calais. Fake camps, mock-ups of tanks and planes, wooden cannons, and inflatable equipment appeared along the coast. From the air, it all looked like a real army, ready to cross the strait at any moment. Radio broadcasts also became part of the show. The Allies deliberately created active radio exchanges between fictitious units, simulating preparations for a large-scale operation. German intelligence intercepted these signals and drew exactly the conclusions that the Allies had hoped for. American General George Patton played a key role in this illusion. The Germans considered him one of the most aggressive and talented U.S. commanders. He was deliberately appointed commander of a fictitious group that was supposedly preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. For the German command, this was further confirmation that their expectations were correct. The deception was also maintained through double agents. Early in the war, British counterintelligence took control of almost all German spies in the United Kingdom. Through them, carefully measured false information was transmitted to Berlin, gradually forming a false picture of the future invasion. Meanwhile, the real preparations for the Normandy landings were hidden behind a veil of silence. Radio communications were minimized, troop movements were restricted, and the leakage of any information was strictly controlled. Even among mid-level officers, almost no one knew the full picture. On the German side, the situation was complicated by internal disputes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for the defense of the Western European coast, insisted that the Allies should be stopped directly on the beaches. He demanded that fortifications be strengthened and that any landing be met with an immediate response. However, part of the German command believed that the main blow would be struck later and elsewhere, and therefore reserves should be kept deep within the territory. It was these doubts that the Allies exploited. Even after the Normandy landings began, the German leadership remained uncertain for several days whether this was the main attack or a diversionary operation before the real invasion of the Pas-de-Calais. This precious time cost the Wehrmacht the opportunity to react quickly and drive the Allies back into the sea. Deception and disinformation became invisible but decisive weapons. Without firing a single shot, the Allies gained a strategic advantage that later turned into real success on the battlefield. When the time came to act, the Germans were looking the other way. The night of June 5 to 6, 1944, was the calm before the storm. For Europe, it seemed like any other night: dark skies, the sound of the sea, the dim lights of Normandy villages. But on the other side of the English Channel, this night marked the boundary between anticipation and action, between fear and determination. It was during these hours that the fate of the largest amphibious operation in history was decided. On the southern coast of Great Britain, thousands of ships stood at the ready. Landing craft rocked slowly on the waves, filled with soldiers who waited silently for the signal to set sail. Many of them understood that by dawn, their lives would change forever. Some prayed, some wrote their last letters home, others simply stared into the darkness, trying to quell their fear. The weather remained the main threat. Storm winds, high waves, and thick clouds could thwart the landing. The command postponed the operation several times, weighing each forecast. Finally, General Dwight David Eisenhower made one of the most difficult decisions of his life: to act. The short phrase with which he gave the order became a symbol of the entire operation: "Okay, let's go." The first to enter the battle were not those who landed on the beaches. In the middle of the night, hundreds of transport planes carrying paratroopers took to the air. American and British paratroopers flew over occupied France, knowing that they would land behind enemy lines, far from the main forces, without support, and often without communication. Their task was to capture bridges, intersections, and roads that could be used by the Germans to transfer reserves. They had to paralyze the defenses before the first soldiers set foot on the Normandy sand. It was an extremely high-risk mission, where every mistake could cost lives. The night landing turned out to be chaotic. Strong winds and German anti-aircraft fire scattered the paratroopers dozens of kilometers from their planned zones. Units lost their commanders, soldiers found themselves surrounded, often not knowing where they were. However, even in this chaos, many tasks were accomplished. Small groups acted independently, attacking German posts, destroying communications, and spreading panic. At the same time, the fleet began to move at sea. A giant armada slowly crossed the English Channel. It was a sight that is difficult to imagine. Ships of all types, from battleships to small landing craft, moved in complete darkness, maintaining strict order. A mistake by one ship could lead to disaster. On board, soldiers received their final instructions. Many were learning for the first time where the landing would take place. The word Normandy was whispered, as if it were a secret that could still be lost. In those moments, fear mingled with a sense of historic mission. Meanwhile, preparations for the air campaign began over France. Allied bombers attacked coastal fortifications, batteries, and communication centers. The roar of explosions pierced the night, signaling that the wait was over. For German soldiers, this night was the beginning of anxiety, but not yet clarity. They did not know where the main strike would take place. There were only a few hours left until dawn. Paratroopers were already fighting behind enemy lines. The fleet was approaching the coast. Commanders looked at their watches, realizing that there was no turning back. When the first rays of the sun touched the waters of the English Channel, Europe awoke to a new reality. A day was beginning that would go down in history as D-Day. The morning of June 6, 1944 dawned slowly and coldly. A gray sky hung over the English Channel, and waves crashed against the sides of the landing craft approaching the coast of France. For thousands of soldiers, these moments became the longest of their lives. Some clutched their weapons so tightly that their fingers ached, while others stared ahead as if trying to see the future. Everyone understood that what they had been preparing for months was about to begin, and there was no turning back. At 6 a.m., the Allied fleet opened fire on German fortifications. Battleships and cruisers shelled the coast, trying to destroy the guns and bunkers of the Atlantic Wall. The earth shook from the explosions, and from the sea it seemed that the enemy's defenses were about to be broken. However, many of the fortifications proved to be stronger than expected. Some of the German batteries survived the bombardment and waited for their moment. As the landing craft drew closer, the artillery barrage gradually subsided. The moment that could not be undone had arrived. The gangways were lowered, and the soldiers stepped into the cold water. Some of them immediately disappeared under the waves, weighed down by their equipment. Others were met with heavy machine gun and mortar fire. The assault on Omaha Beach was particularly bloody. Here, the German defenses proved to be the strongest, and errors in intelligence and bombing cost the Allies thousands of lives. The soldiers found themselves on open sand without cover, under targeted fire from the heights. Some units lost their commanders in the first minutes of the battle, communication was disrupted, and the situation seemed hopeless. In other areas, the landing was slightly more successful. At Utah Beach, American troops landed off course, but this accidentally worked in their favor. The resistance was weaker. British and Canadian units also faced fierce resistance but were able to gradually break through the first line of defense. The battle on the beaches was not a quick attack. It was a series of separate, often uncoordinated clashes. Small groups of soldiers acted independently, using shell craters, wrecked equipment, and any uneven terrain as cover. The initiative of junior officers and sergeants often decided more than the initial plans of the headquarters. The Allies had superiority in the air. Aircraft continuously attacked German positions, roads, and reserve columns. However, even this could not instantly change the situation on the ground. Every meter of sand had to be fought for at the cost of lives. By noon, it became clear that, despite huge losses, the landing had not failed. The Allies were able to hold on to the coast. It was a critical moment. Either the troops would consolidate their positions and begin to advance inland, or the Germans would be able to drive them back into the sea. Tension reached its peak both on the battlefield and in headquarters. For many soldiers, this day turned into a never-ending nightmare of explosions, screams, and chaos. But it was in this chaos that the success of the operation was born. What had been just a plan on paper the night before was now becoming a reality, secured with blood. By the evening of June 6, the Allies already had a foothold in France. It was fragile, unstable, and won at a terrible price, but it existed. The second front had been opened. After the first hours of the landing, it became clear that D-Day had not ended in a breakthrough or triumph. It turned into a protracted struggle for survival right on the seashore. The beaches of Normandy, which just yesterday had been peaceful strips of sand, had now become a battlefield where human life lost its usual value and was reduced to minutes, and sometimes seconds. The situation on Omaha Beach was particularly tragic. The coast was littered with dead bodies, overturned boats, and destroyed equipment. Medics worked under fire, pulling the wounded out of the water and sand. Many soldiers died not from bullets, but from drowning. Heavy equipment pulled them to the bottom as they tried to reach the shore. The command lost control of many units. Radio communication was almost non-existent, officers were killed or wounded, and orders were not getting through. In these conditions, the soldiers acted instinctively. In small groups, they broke through, climbed the slopes, and destroyed machine gun nests using grenades and improvised weapons. It was these disorganized but desperate actions that gradually broke the German defense. In other areas, the situation was no less tense, though less catastrophic. Canadian troops landing at Juno Beach encountered strong resistance in coastal villages. The fighting quickly moved from the beaches to the streets, where every house could be a fortified position. Progress was slow and bloody, but the Canadians managed to advance further than planned on the first day. British units on Gold Beach and Sword Beach also paid a high price for every step. Here, the defense was better organized than expected, and German counterattacks forced the Allies to constantly hold their positions under threat of breakthrough. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry could not always get out of the water or got stuck in the sand, becoming easy targets. Chaos reigned everywhere. Plans made months earlier crumbled under the pressure of reality. However, it was in this chaos that new tactics were born. Soldiers learned to fight here and now, using every opportunity. The initiative of individuals often changed the course of battle in a particular area more than orders from above. Despite fierce resistance, German troops were also in a difficult position. They did not have a clear picture of what was happening along the entire coast. The Allies' deception continued to work. The German command was still not sure whether Normandy was the main target of the attack. As a result, reserves were brought in slowly and hesitantly, wasting precious time. By the end of the day, the beaches of Normandy were literally covered in blood. Allied losses numbered in the tens of thousands of dead, wounded, and missing. But despite the terrible price, the most important thing was achieved: the troops did not retreat. They held their ground, broke through the first line of defense, and began to move beyond the beaches. The beaches became a symbol not only of suffering but also of determination. Here, the myth of the impregnability of the Atlantic Wall was shattered. Here, it became clear that Germany could and would be driven out of Western Europe. That day did not bring a quick victory, but it made it inevitable. As evening fell, the sea slowly washed away the traces of battle, but the memory of that day's events remained forever, in the minds of those who survived and in the history of the world. After bloody battles on the beaches, the Allies faced a new, equally difficult task: to hold their positions. The landing itself did not guarantee success. The beachhead in Normandy was narrow, overcrowded with troops and equipment, and vulnerable to counterattacks. During those days, it was decided whether D-Day would mark the beginning of the liberation of Europe or turn into a short and tragic episode of the war. The first hours after the landing were critical. The Allies hastily transferred new units, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies to the shore. Landing ships worked non-stop, often under fire, and the wounded were evacuated back to Britain. The Normandy coast turned into a giant transshipment point where every minute counted. The German command tried to organize counterattacks, but acted too late. Reserves were brought in gradually and without a unified plan. The Allies' air superiority made any movement during the day deadly dangerous. Columns of German troops were attacked before they even reached the front line. One of the main problems for the Allies was logistics. The ports of France remained in German hands, and without a stable supply, an offensive was impossible. The answer to this problem was the creation of artificial ports, a unique engineering solution that had no analogues. These structures allowed ships to be unloaded directly on the shore, providing the army with everything it needed. At the same time, the struggle to expand the bridgehead continued. The fighting gradually moved deeper into Normandy, where the terrain proved to be unexpectedly difficult. The rural landscape with dense hedgerows, the so-called bocage, turned every field into a natural fortress. German soldiers skillfully used these conditions for defense, forcing the Allies to fight for every meter of land. American, British, and Canadian troops changed their tactics on the fly. Tanks were equipped with additional devices to break through hedgerows, infantry learned to operate in small groups, and artillery played a decisive role in destroying fortified positions. The advance was slow and exhausting, but steady. The morale of the troops remained mixed. On the one hand, there were losses, fatigue, and the constant threat of death. On the other hand, there was the realization that the worst was behind them. The soldiers knew they would not be thrown back into the sea. They were standing on European soil and holding it. By the end of June 1944, the Allies had managed to unite separate bridgeheads into a single front line. This meant that the operation had achieved its main goal, a solid base for further offensive had been created. Normandy became the gateway through which the Allied armies began to return to the heart of Europe. Consolidating the beachhead did not bring resounding victories or symbolic moments. It was a period of hard, monotonous work, where victory was measured not in kilometers, but in the ability to hold positions for another day. However, it was this phase that made everything that happened next possible. When the first weeks of fighting in Normandy were over, it became clear that Operation Overlord was neither a quick nor an easy victory. It became a turning point in the war precisely because of its scale, high cost, and strategic consequences. The results of the landing were measured not by a single day or a single battle, but by a change in the entire logic of the war in Europe. First and foremost, the Allies achieved their main goal: the Second Front in Western Europe was opened and held. This meant that Germany could no longer concentrate its main forces against the USSR. The Wehrmacht was forced to transfer divisions to the west, weakening the Eastern Front. The balance of power finally shifted away from the Third Reich. The military results were gradual but inevitable. After securing their position in Normandy, the Allies began to prepare a breakthrough from their bridgehead. In July 1944, American troops launched a large-scale offensive that broke through German defenses. This breakthrough paved the way for the rapid liberation of France and showed that the Wehrmacht was no longer capable of holding long defensive lines under constant pressure. One of the most important consequences of the operation was the liberation of Paris. Although the French capital was not a primary military target, its liberation in August 1944 had enormous symbolic significance. It demonstrated the collapse of Nazi control over Western Europe and dealt a powerful moral blow to Germany. The losses on both sides were enormous. The Allies paid with tens of thousands of dead and wounded in just the first weeks of the campaign. German losses were also catastrophic: divisions destroyed or captured, equipment lost, experienced officers who could not be replaced. The war began to take on an irreversible character for Germany. Operation Overlord proved the effectiveness of Allied cooperation. Armies from different countries operated under a single command, using shared resources and strategy. This was an important lesson for future international military coalitions and showed that joint action can be more effective than separate national efforts. The economic and industrial potential of the United States was fully realized. The flow of equipment, ammunition, and human reserve seemed inexhaustible. Against this backdrop, the German economy, exhausted by bombing and a lack of resources, could no longer compete on equal terms. The war gradually turned into a competition in which the winner was predetermined. Another important result was a psychological shift. For the occupied peoples of Europe, the Normandy landings were a sign of hope. Resistance intensified, collaborationist regimes began to lose confidence, and the belief in Germany's defeat became increasingly real. For the United States itself, the operation became the moment of its final establishment as the leading military power of the West. America was no longer just the arsenal of democracy, it became the main active participant in the liberation of Europe. This had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Thus, the results of Operation Overlord went far beyond Normandy. They determined the further course of the war, accelerated the collapse of the Nazi regime, and laid the foundation for a new stage in world history. The Normandy landings were not just a major military operation. They were an event that changed the course of World War II and shaped the post-war world. Their consequences extended far beyond the front lines in France and were felt for decades after the end of hostilities. The first and most obvious consequence was that the defeat of Nazi Germany became a matter of time. After the opening of the Second Front, the Wehrmacht found itself in a strategic trap. Germany could no longer maneuver its forces between East and West as it had done before. Every Red Army offensive on the Eastern Front was now accompanied by pressure from the Allies in the West. For the Third Reich, the war became a struggle for survival with no chance of victory. For Europe, the Normandy landings marked the beginning of liberation from Nazi occupation. The countries of Western Europe gradually restored their statehood, returned their legitimate governments, and began the difficult process of healing after years of terror and destruction. At the same time, the war left deep wounds, destroyed cities, millions of refugees, and economies in ruins. For the United States, the consequences were no less significant. America emerged from the war not only as the victor, but also as the world leader. Its military, economic, and political weight became decisive in shaping the new international order. The U.S. could no longer return to isolationism. The world expected it to take responsibility and participate in global processes. It was after the war that a new international security system began to take shape. The realization of the disasters that could result from a lack of cooperation between states was one of the main lessons of World War II. The creation of international organizations and alliances was intended to prevent a repeat of such a tragedy, although new conflicts were already brewing. At the same time, the Normandy landings became a symbol of joint struggle. They showed that countries with different interests, cultures, and political systems were capable of uniting in the face of a common threat. This experience of cooperation was of enormous importance for post-war Europe and the world as a whole. For millions of people on both sides of the front, the consequences were personal. For some, it meant liberation and hope for a new life. For others, it meant defeat, loss, and the need to come to terms with their responsibility for what had been done. The memory of Normandy became part of humanity's collective memory, a reminder of the price of freedom. From a historical perspective, D-Day ceased to be just a date. It has become a boundary between eras, between a world where dictatorships could conquer continents with impunity and a world that, despite all its contradictions, sought new rules for coexistence. That is why the Normandy landings remain one of the most important events of the 20th century.